The New York One story does not explain how these leaders get elected. These leaders are elected by county committee members, which represent each block of New York City, one for each block. If we want to change the Board of Elections, we need to change these leaders and ask them questions. Run for county committee using Rep My Block.
The controversy runs so deep, other county leaders would not even speak to New York One about how the Board of Elections functions. Ultimately, current and former employees at the board say it's these county leaders who have real sway over how the board functions and how our elections are run. For starters, each borough has a chair for the Republican and Democratic parties, all seen here. These leaders and their organizations typically recommend who gets nominated to the 10-member Board of Elections. The City Council usually rubber stamps those appointments, essentially meaning each county leader and organization has a seat on the board.
Basically, what political machines do is they suppress democracy. The whole game here is to prevent you from getting on the ballot in the first place. Joe Crowley's not just a congressman. He's the congressman, he's the chairman of the Queens Democratic Party, he's the district leader. Joe Crowley has appointed every Board of Elections judge. When you turn in your signatures to get on the ballot, any tiny little discrepancy in the signature, they toss the signature out. So even though the actual requirement is 1,250, because we're challenging the boss, we need to collect 10,000 signatures.
Hi, my name is Ben Yee. I'm the secretary of the Manhattan Democratic Party, and I'm also the Democratic State Committeeman for the 66th Assembly District. If you're unfamiliar with what any of those things are, political parties in the United States are broken down into roughly 3 levels. You have a national party, think the DNC or the RNC. You have a state party, and then you have a local party. In New York City, our local party is at the county level, and every borough is a county. So this is how I got involved. I started out on the Obama campaign in 2008. My best friend on the campaign asked me to join the Manhattan Young Democrats. At every level of the two-party system, there are governing committees. These are the people who decide what the party does, how it spends its money, and who it supports. And all of those people are elected. Now, I'd like to emphasize, the county committee is not evil, and it's not bad. It's an incredibly important institution. But the members certainly were unprepared for democracy. Even with our group of new members, nearly half of the seats were still unfilled, and not everyone elected attends. So why is this the case? It's not a mistake. The parties don't necessarily want you to know about or to participate in the party democracy. At the end of the day, political parties derive their power from controlling resources and influencing political outcomes. That gets really difficult when there's a lot of people participating who aren't all on the same page as, say, county leadership. Political machines thrive by keeping engagement low and restricting voting. We often think of voter restrictions as voter ID laws, but we've all experienced voter suppression. The most common form is just not telling you when the election is, or that you even have the right to vote. Once you have people not participating, then party leaders and other influencers have the ability to support candidates based on loyalty, not on merit. So I'd like to encourage you to go out and get involved in your county party. Vote in county elections. Get in touch with your party leadership.
Laura Mueller-Sopart is a politically active Brooklynite, and voting to her is very important.
Being able to vote was that one moment where you could say, I'm going to the polls, I'm making my voice heard, and to have that taken away, it shocked me. It's not what I expected to happen.
But it did, in June of 2020. Like thousands of other New Yorkers, Mueller-Sopart requested an absentee ballot. She was in Chicago at the time and wanted it sent there. She got the application in just in time. But that ballot arrived 10 days after the election. She couldn't vote.
It really hurt. Democracy already felt like it was in a really precarious place, obviously, for the past 5 years. For someone with my politics and living in this neighborhood, and to not be able to have any say in what direction that was going to go in that moment, felt incredibly undemocratic and un-American.
Mueller-Sopart is one of thousands of New Yorkers who have had trouble casting their ballots over the years. And even when some are able to vote, problems can still persist.
We are at the Met. We are here because I voted early here for the New York mayoral primary, which I would later find out, my ballot got leaked, or it's available publicly because the Board of Elections does not maintain the secrecy of every ballot that is cast in New York City.
That's Mayor de Blasio's son, Dante.
The right to a secret ballot.
A report from Princeton University last month found voting data released by the Board of Elections in August did not effectively shield the ballots of 378 voters who happened to be the only people voting in their election district. It meant anyone could know who Dante de Blasio voted for.
It was shocking. It was disturbing to know that something I took for granted, that my ballot would be secret, is now public information. And I don't see any compelling reason the Board of Elections should be releasing the information of me and the 370 other people just so anyone can look.
2 separate blunders. And we know there's many more.
As this full Board of Commissioners has said, the reporting error was unacceptable, and we apologize to the voters of our great city for this error.
Nearly every year for the past 6 years, the Board of Elections has faced scandals or controversy, some of them directly linked to the board's mismanagement and lack of oversight. New York One has spent months interviewing employees, new and old, stakeholders, and elected officials on the state of our city's election administration, finding a series of missteps and mismanagement for years.
We run a clean shop here.
In 2016, the board illegally purged about 117,000 voters off the rolls in Brooklyn. In 2018, long lines and clogged machines led to massive chaos at the polls. The board's leader initially attributed it to weather.
If people are coming in with wet clothing and they're holding the ballots up against their raincoats or their umbrella drips on it, yes, all of that is going to make a difference.
Soon after, New York One revealed the board's leader was getting all expense-paid trips across the country by a major contractor. He was later fined by the city's Conflicts of Interest Board.
I flew out to Nevada on a Wednesday, had a conference on a Thursday, came home on Friday. It's nothing more, nothing less than that.
In 2020, the board admitted thousands of absentee ballots didn't get to voters on time. And even after that, more than 83,000 absentee ballots that were returned were invalidated, tossed out for technical errors. Technicalities, the board says, are dictated by state election law. Ultimately, the board confirmed about 20% of absentee ballots weren't counted. Which brings us to June 29th, 2021.
We have some breaking news about the races.
For the first time, the board would reveal unofficial election results from a new system of ranked choice voting.
It is unclear at this hour where those votes came from, how the vote total increased so dramatically.
But it quickly became clear those numbers were wrong.
The Board of Elections, an agency that has been preparing for this simulation for weeks, apparently forgot to take out tens of thousands of practice ballots out of the system.
It would be 7 hours after the actual release of results before the Board of Elections admitted what happened. 135,000 dummy ballots, which were used to test the system, were not cleared before the board started tabulating the vote. So the unofficial results were wrong.
It was caught literally within minutes. Unfortunately, the fix, the undo, wasn't quite so easy to rectify with speed. It was easy enough to rectify in reality, but not in terms of the impatience of the public to get the information, and rightfully so. Good morning, Chairman.
Board officials say it was a simple mistake. But New York One has learned those officials failed to accept assistance, which could have averted the crisis.
Well, what happened was that they installed the software and saw that it was working, and then they didn't really listen to our advice about how to use it or how to display the results. And in particular, they didn't accept our offer to do a parallel tabulation of the results to double check their work before they released it to the public.
Did they just not respond, or did they say they weren't interested?
For the large part, they didn't respond. It was actually kind of frustrating to have a contract with the city to provide services and for them not to avail themselves of our services.
Caleb Klepner is a subcontractor with the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, the company that created the tabulation software. His organization offered training to the board. It offered to run a simulation side by side to make sure the count went well. Emails exclusively obtained through the Freedom of Information law by New York One confirm the center reached out multiple times to offer support. Klepner says they were unresponsive.
We were prepared to provide training on using the software, but in fact the software is very easy to use, and the people at the Board of Elections who were actually running the software said, no problem, we got it downloaded, we made sure it's the right software, and it's running fine, and we don't need help.
So they didn't even get any training on it?
Not very much. I wasn't the only one involved, so I know I didn't do any training with them.
I can't speak to response or lack of response. I wasn't there.
At the time, the board's executive director, Michael Ryan, was on medical leave. He just returned last month. Its administrative manager, Pam Perkins, had just retired. She wasn't there either. Its deputy executive director and its operations manager were running the show. Sources at the board tell New York One there was a divide among leadership on how quickly the ranked choice results should even be released.
There was a demand for transparency, and there was a demand for speed. I have always said, and you've heard me say this, we will never sacrifice accuracy for speed. That seems to have happened here, which now causes us to go back and say, okay, how did this happen, and how do we fix it?
The error occurred in the Queen's office. Sources at the board tell New York One many employees there were overwhelmed and overworked. The board says it was human error, not a training issue. One longtime employee at the board did not follow the procedures laid out. She has since retired. Even so, the error, once again, does not instill confidence for some voters in the New York City Board of Elections.
It was just another one of those moments where you're really stunned that there's no recourse for a voter. And it's also not clear what they're going to do differently next time to make sure that that doesn't happen again.
All this week, New York One's been examining the city's Board of Elections, which struggles and often fails to make the process of casting a ballot an easy thing for New Yorkers. Tonight, in the second part of her series called Ballot Blunders, our Courtney Gross examines claims of patronage and nepotism at the board, where critics claim that party leaders and lawmakers can easily appoint and recommend friends and family to the ranks of the board. Here's her exclusive report.
Last week, we were looking for one commissioner at the New York City Board of Elections.
Commissioner!
Gino Marmorato was not interested in talking. New York One wanted to discuss his deep ties to the Bronx Republican Party.
I felt like I needed to do more. I needed to give back more.
Marmorato is the Bronx GOP chairman's brother-in-law.
Commissioner Marmorato.
Present.
His familial connections have never been publicly disclosed before, but it's a prime example of how things work at the City Board of Elections, where local party leaders can install family members, friends, and patrons in plum positions, some with serious power. Critics say it creates a system where the staff's loyalty lies with party organizations, a power structure riddled with patronage and nepotism. Some county political leaders have fired back, saying the criticism comes from people from the losing end of political battles.
I think that especially in Queens, things are run very well. And I know that there are detractors out there trying to say that there's all sorts of corruption or whatever they're crying. But you have to understand that these are people who have run against the county organization and lost. So therefore, it is a measure of sour grapes there.
The controversy runs so deep, other county leaders would not even speak to New York One about how the Board of Elections functions.
Let's give it to our Brooklyn mayor!
Brooklyn Democratic leader Rodney's Bishat Hermelin canceled an interview with New York One last month, refusing to talk about the BOE. We attended the county's pre-election breakfast last week.
Hi, we've been trying to get in touch with you for
I'm sorry.
we've been doing about the Board of Elections.
But again, the county leader would not take our questions.
I have one question.
The Assemblywoman opted to walk in the middle of Flatbush Avenue into oncoming traffic rather than talk to us about the board. Ultimately, current and former employees at the board say it's these county leaders who have real sway over how the board functions and how our elections are run. For starters, each borough has a chair for the Republican and Democratic parties, all seen here. These leaders and their organizations typically recommend who gets nominated to the 10-member Board of Elections. The City Council usually rubber stamps those appointments, essentially meaning each county leader and organization has a seat on the board. That system trickles down to the staff as well. Sources at the board tell New York One the top positions are divided up among party leadership. So behind the scenes, the top-level jobs with the highest pay are doled out to certain county leaders to appoint. For instance, the head of voter registration is a Staten Island Republican, also the mother of the former congressman and current GOP candidate for borough president. It goes down to lower-level staff, too. State law requires hundreds of positions at the board be divided between the two parties. So let's say a Republican is inputting voter registration data, then a Democrat will review it. That's hundreds of jobs. And critics say that breeds a system of patronage where party loyalty can come first.
It can be very frustrating for the executive director and the co-executive director who find that the staff who theoretically report to them often have greater loyalty to the party county leader who sponsored their appointment at the board. That directly relates to the competence and capacity of the agency to fulfill its mission.
A review of the staff list found more than a dozen family members of elected officials or former elected officials work at the board. That included, at one point, the niece of the state attorney general.
At some point in time, I had a niece who went to attend college and who did work at the Board of Elections, but she no longer works there.
The commissioners themselves have been fined by the city's Conflicts of Interest Board for putting family in positions. In 2015, the Queens Republican commissioner was fined $10,000 for getting his daughter's boyfriend a job at the board. That boyfriend still works there. The year before, the Queens Democratic commissioner was fined for putting his wife on the payroll so she could get health insurance. She is no longer employed at the board. And it goes on. New York One has learned the son of the Queens County Republican chairwoman works at the Queens office. His salary is a little over $48,000. Joanne Areola is also running for city council in Queens.
Did you help him get that position there?
He applied like anyone else. He was qualified, and he got a job at the Board of Elections. If a resume is submitted and they are qualified, then they should be given a job because we need qualified people at the Board of Elections. It doesn't matter if they're related to someone. If a qualified person receives a resume, which I'm sure even you receive resumes from friends working for New York One, or, you know, in my professional life, people ask. But when they're not qualified, they're not hired.
Did you submit his resume?
I did not submit his resume. I don't believe so. But, you know, his resume, he is qualified and he was hired. And I have had nothing to do with his employment since then.
Back in 2011 and 2012, the daughter of the deputy executive director of the board, a Bronx Republican, also worked at the BOE. She took home a little more than $18,000, according to the BOE.
As you indicated,
the board's current executive director brushed off the criticism of patronage and nepotism.
In terms of nepotism in that sense, the Board of Elections, like every other industry, is an industry. I'm sure if you go up and down the scale at New York 1, there might be people that knew somebody and got a job at New York 1. They might have been a neighbor, they might have been a friend, they might be a cousin. It happens in industries. That in and of itself is not indicative of a problem. It's the work that the people do.
In 2013, the city's Department of Investigation discovered about 1 in every 13 employees were related to someone at the Board of Elections. Since then, board officials say they no longer have immediate family members serving as subordinates. Despite the multiple examples of patronage or nepotism New York 1 found, some current and former county leaders say there is nothing wrong with how the board operates.
Everything is a system of patronage. I mean, look at City Hall. Look at the state legislature. Look at the Capitol. Everything is patronage. It doesn't mean that it's all bad. Patronage is not a bad thing at all. Because patronage, you get to help people in your communities.
Meanwhile, former employees of the board claim this system has serious consequences.
People were drunk. There were fistfights.
That's Betty Ann Canizio, a former deputy clerk in Brooklyn. She was suspended from the board in 2016 for her involvement in the purging of 117,000 voters from the voter roll. She denies having anything to do with it, and she later resigned from the board.
I never did anything. I never deleted anybody. I don't know how to use the program.
Canizio says lack of training and accountability at the board is what leads to mistakes.
When I took the job at the board, I asked if there was any training for me, and I was laughed at by human resources. No training. I think that sums it up. Chaotic. How they pull off an election is like how Biden just got out of Afghanistan. A wing and a prayer.
Okay, our Courtney Gross joins me now with more. There's been some reaction to this, even today, right, Courtney?
Yeah, absolutely. I imagine there's going to be a lot of reaction to it, but we did get a statement from the Brooklyn Democratic Party this afternoon. Obviously, you saw our interaction with the Brooklyn Democratic Party chairwoman there. We should know, or our viewers at home should know, that we were there trying to chase down a tip because we had heard that there may have been a relative that worked at the board related to the assemblywoman. So they put out a statement tonight saying, or this afternoon saying, that our reporting had been aggressive and cantankerous. And then they said about that rumor that we were trying to chase down that it was creating, or we were creating, disruption and havoc after being told the tip was untrue and is a waste of time for everyone, including New York 1. And this is a proliferation of the, quote, "they all look alike to me" mentality. And what's interesting about this statement here, Errol, is that they're obviously attacking our credibility, attacking my credibility, and the assemblywoman there isn't necessarily talking about what she actually thinks should change at the Board of Elections, whether it's the structure or anything else. And we, as I said in the story there, we had an interview scheduled with the assemblywoman on September 9th. And for more context, we had that interview scheduled. And then once I started telling her office what the context of the interview was going to be, they knew it was going to be about the Board of Elections and an investigation. And once I started saying that, actually that morning, I told them that it was going to be about patronage and nepotism, and they abruptly canceled the
That's
interview.
when she ran into the traffic. I get it. So for the record, does she have a relative who works at the board? She might be the only chair who doesn't at this point, if that's
well,
true.
The spokesperson we spoke to and the alleged relative that we had spoke to said that no, that they're not related. So obviously we take them for their word at that.
Well, but yeah, I guess up in the Bronx, I mean, a remarkable scene where somebody else running from you, right? Where you go to their house and you kind of knock on the door and just ask to have. But was this person saying that, oh, I didn't appoint my brother-in-law, I got somebody else to appoint my brother-in-law, and they think that makes it okay?
So that's actually the Bronx GOP. So let's switch from Democrats to Republicans now. And that was us in front of the commissioner of the Bronx Republicans House trying to get an interview with him. We'd obviously reached out to him multiple times as well through the Board of Elections and then personally as well. And we received a statement from the Bronx GOP as well related to that. And in that statement, it says that Chairman Rendino was not the person that put up the nomination of his brother-in-law, that it was someone else in the executive committee. And it says, quote, Chairman Rendino's only responsibility in this process was convening the executive committee in order for us to consider and vote on the recommendation. And it goes into the Commissioner Marmorato's qualifications. He was a Republican lawyer.
Oh, I'm sure he's very qualified. I'm sure he's very qualified. Like Joan Arialo's son was qualified, and she didn't put his name in. I guess he maybe just took his resume and put it in himself.
It's unclear. She said that, you heard her statement there. Yeah. She said she didn't do it. She fumbled a little bit there, but...
Look, obviously your credibility in your reporting is not in question. The reporting is excellent. This needed to come out a long time ago. The board is stocked from top to bottom with people who are cronies, and there are even people like Keith Wright who says he doesn't think there's anything wrong with that. It sounds though that like there might be something wrong with that because they keep screwing up the elections and they're not being chosen on merit. That's the real heart of the problem.
That's what critics will obviously say, is that this system of nepotism and patronage is what leads to all of the mess ups essentially. I mean, the Board of Elections by and large isn't posting positions on Indeed or any kind of city job site. They're by and large choosing these people to fill these positions through these county leaders. That is how they are set up. They would argue that it is set up that way because of state election law. And we should note, the Board of Elections lost people during COVID. They were given a very difficult task to run these elections during the worst pandemic that this country has ever seen. And we don't have any sweeping generalization that every single person that works at the Board of Elections is a bad employee. There's absolutely qualified people that work there. But it is the system and the structure that they are given that what critics would say is obviously an issue.
Well, let me say, first of all, for the record, that you are expected and paid to be aggressive and cantankerous, and we wouldn't have you any other way. So that is the right way to do this job. I should also say that, if Assemblywoman Bichotte Hermelin wants to talk to, she's welcome to come in and she can tell us, whoever related to her or not, she helped get jobs at the Board of Elections, because that's what it is we are trying to find out. Thanks very much, Courtney. Great reporting. With early voting in the race for mayor starting later this month, is the Board of Elections ready? All this week, we've been looking at the board's past failures and examining nepotism in its ranks. Tonight, we focus on how the board could be fixed, from a change in the state constitution to altering how the board's executive director is selected. Our Courtney Gross joins me now with the final part of her series, Ballot Blunders. Good evening, Courtney.
Good evening, Earl. And there are certainly a lot of ideas out there. People have been proposing fixes or reforms for the Board of Elections for years. Advocates are hoping there is momentum now to do something.
This was my first assignment, and the reason why I kind of started doing it was I saw an advertisement that they were short on poll workers, and I was like, this is a big election, this matters so much. I did email.
We were with Mary Vaughn outside of the Brooklyn school where she first served as a poll worker. It was the 2018 midterm election. The turnout was massive. The scanners at the poll site went down.
Our emergency ballot box got so full that we then had to pull the physical bag out, and people were just stuffing their ballots into a bag.
During this year's primary, Vaughn said there were other challenges.
At my site, more than half of the poll workers who were supposed to show up that day didn't show up. Something I would never do.
She told us it's not exactly an experience that boosts her confidence in the city's election administration.
There's so many failures along the way, and if I were on the voting end and saw what had happened at, say, the poll site that I was at in central Brooklyn in June, I would have seriously wondered if my vote was going to be counted.
For years, some poll workers, advocates, and elected officials have slammed the Board of Elections, claiming patronage and nepotism have led to serious dysfunction at the board. Board officials say its issues do not come from its hiring practices.
The overwhelming number of instances when it happens, where there's a mistake, it happens at poll sites on election day. It's not as much happening in the general offices or in the borough offices and the work that they do.
Still, now, perhaps more than ever before, critics are calling for change.
We were stunned to see how, in very basic ways, from how leadership are selected, what their qualifications have to be, to how staff are hired, and how the agency operates, New York City is possibly the worst in the nation, and certainly an extreme outlier in just some basic ways a public agency should function.
Last month, the Brennan Center released a report detailing some of the board's systemic issues. And like many other groups, it says the time to change the system is now.
Everything we recommend in our report, from creating a more publicly accountable commissioner appointment process, to better training and improving public hiring, to beefing up accountability at the top of the agency when things go wrong. All of these things can be mandated by the state legislature right now without a constitutional amendment.
Generally, stakeholders and advocates say there are two separate options to change the BOE. One involves changing its bipartisan structure, perhaps making it nonpartisan. That would mean changing the state constitution, which is a difficult task. It requires legislation be passed by the state legislature not once, but twice in 2 consecutive legislative sessions. And then it goes to the voters. Currently, the other option is gaining some attention. Legislation in Albany to professionalize the institution.
3 weeks before any election in New York City, I stop and say, gee, I wonder what's going to go wrong this time. And I have never been disappointed. And that's a problem. I believe
Senator Liz Krueger has pushed for a bill to change how the board's leadership is selected.
It would require qualifications for the senior staff at the board, and decisions about who those senior staff are would be made by a combination of review by the mayor, the controller, the city council speaker. So we would like to take away some of the historical patronage, electoral two-party control of the process and make it, to some degree, a less political assignment.
It's unclear whether her proposal will have enough support to actually move forward, considering it would potentially weaken the influence of the county political organizations these lawmakers rely on.
There are certainly some people out there who think that I, as a legislator, shouldn't be messing with a system that, was designed outside of the context of legislative process. I disagree with them.
The board's leadership has not backed any changes, simply saying it would comply with whatever the state legislature decides to do.
If they come up with a new mandate, we'll follow the new mandate.
To be honest, I just feel like they're...
But for those on the ground on Election Day, making sure workers are qualified could make a big difference.
I think that there's a little bit of a, we don't want to accept the help we're being offered. We've got this maybe attitude, and not a lot of oversight and not a lot of transparency about how people get into the roles they get into and whether they're qualified, and that really comes down and affects the poll workers and makes a lot of people have bad experiences and don't want to come back and do it.
And the assembly sponsor of that bill, Neely Rosick of Queens, said today it could have a tougher fight in her house in the assembly. And Errol, the thought behind that is, sources tell us, is that lawmakers in the assembly may not be as perhaps independent as those who were recently elected to the state senate. Perhaps those lawmakers in the assembly are closer to county leaders and may not want to sort of upend the system that obviously benefits them, like we've been reporting all week.
There are a number of county leaders who themselves are legislators, right? I mean, that will influence this conversation a great deal as well.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been talking about Rodney's Bichot-Hermelin. She is obviously the leader of the Brooklyn Democratic Party, and she is a sponsor of the assembly bill. We looked that up today. As for the other lawmakers,
The state senator, Liz Krueger, believes that she's confident that it will pass her House, perhaps early in the legislative session in January, but it's the Assembly that is the really big question mark there.
Right, and when it comes to, there's an efficiency question here too, right? From what you've reported earlier this week, there are a lot of functions that are specifically and deliberately duplicated because you have Republican staffers and you have Democratic staffers, and the idea is that they're watching each other's work, so to speak.
Yeah, but there's a debate on how far this bipartisan issue can go, right? So it says in our state constitution that the Board of Elections needs to be bipartisan. And then, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but in state election law, it also says that certain positions at the Board of Elections needs to be bipartisan. And there's somewhat of a debate of how much bipartisan and double checking, like we've talked about this week, there really needs to be. Can you basically get rid of some of those positions that are potentially duplicative?
Okay, we'll see what the legislature comes up with. Thanks very much.
If you ever voted, you probably know your presidential candidate. You might even know your congressional race, maybe even your state senator. But if you go down further down the ballot, you might see things like civil court judge, state committee, district leader, county committee. Do you have any idea what those things are?
So what exactly is county committee then?
Somebody makes an ad hominem attack in a debate.
So the Queens County folks are now letting us who are outside.
We have questions. Can we ask questions? This is what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like.
1 in 3 of your state's legislators are chosen in special election. That happens when someone dies or get indicted or has to resign. Happen a lot in New York. County committee picks who the nominee will be. So 1/3 of your state legislators are chosen by county committee, which of course you know nothing about it.
And it shouldn't be so esoteric. You know, it shouldn't be that only a handful of really elected leaders, not even, regular folks, know how it works.
It's not a mistake. The parties don't necessarily want you to know about or to participate in the party democracy.
Public advocate candidate Theo Chino crashed the mayor's press conference.
I'm running so that I can represent them, and the Board of Election is so racist.
I'm running for public advocate for the real poor.
Why are you so hostile to any change, especially change that actually just makes it easier for people to participate? The usual answer to that question when you dig into such things is that, well, he has a personal financial stake in the outcome.
That the idea behind these volunteer party positions is part of what we're supposed to do is hold our elected officials accountable.
So I really believe this is what democracy looks like.
I'm coming to make a mess. Everyone, I would like you to run for county committee. Everybody needs to run for county committee.
Once you sign it, you give it back to Claire.
So petition cleaning, basically what we're doing, we're going through all of these names, making sure that everything is legible.
This stuff seems like a whole lot of stupid work, but you'd rather sit and do this for 3 hours than for somebody to drag you through court for 6 days. And what they will do sometimes, if they have enough stuff to play with, they know that eventually you're going to get on the ballot, but they're going to keep you busy until the day before election. So then you have no time.
So the Whiteheads are like legendary. They started organizing on their own, figuring all this stuff out from scratch. This is the war room for every insurgent campaign in Queens.
We're a country that's supposed to be set up where people are supposed to have the final say. What happens is those who are already entrenched select people. It's going up against the establishment in the true sense of the word. So you have to make sure you have as much stuff in order as possible.
Well, guys, we got a lot of work to do.
He can't get challenged by any down ballot incumbent. Anyone who wants to keep their job in New York City would never dream of challenging Joe Crowley.
Yeah.
It has to come from outside of Queens. It has to come from someone who's new on the political scene that they don't foresee coming, that they can't offer a job or pressure in another way. And it has to be someone that represents our community in more ways than one. Basically, an insurgent outside grassroots candidate that's a woman of color from the Bronx.
Whoo! Ah! Ah! We're like walking closer, and I'm like, oh. Alexandria. Barbara, nice to meet you. Paul, nice to meet you. Running for Congress out in the Bronx and Queens. Everybody said that we couldn't do it. And then they saw how much money we had, and they saw that we had like $2 in December, and they're like, there's no way. And here we are, April 12th, 2018, and we're on the ballot. Unless he sues us. Ah!